Eric and Melissa were giddy with excitement as they unpacked their belongings in their new apartment. Harrow House, the old brick building on the corner of 5th and Maple, had an undeniable charm with its high ceilings, ornate moldings, and creaky wooden floors. They had been searching for months, and this place, with its affordable rent and vintage character, felt like a dream come true. The landlord, Mr. Kavanaugh, was a gaunt man with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets he wasn't eager to share. "It's a good building," he said, handing them the keys. "But it has a history. Some folks find it unsettling." Eric laughed, brushing off the warning. "We love history. Don't worry about us." Melissa offered a polite smile, but Mr. Kavanaugh's words lingered in her mind as they began moving in. The apartment was everything she'd hoped for, yet an undercurrent of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. The first few nights were peaceful. They arranged furniture, hung photos, and toasted to their new life with cheap wine on the fire escape. But the building seemed to have a life of its own. Lights flickered in the hallway, though the wiring had supposedly been updated. Doors creaked open and shut without a breeze. Cold spots appeared in the apartment, even when the heat was running. Eric dismissed it all as quirks of an old building, but Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. One night, Melissa woke to the sound of faint footsteps in the hallway. She nudged Eric awake, but by the time he stirred, the noise had stopped. He grumbled about her overactive imagination and went back to sleep, but Melissa lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence. A week after moving in, Melissa began hearing whispers. They started late at night, faint and indistinct, like a radio tuned to a distant station. At first, she thought it was coming from the neighbors. But when she pressed her ear to the wall, the sound didn't grow louder. Instead, it seemed to echo inside her own head. Eric, ever the skeptic, dismissed her concerns. "It's probably the pipes," he said. "Old buildings make weird noises." But Melissa knew what she heard. The whispers were not random. They were voices, speaking in hushed tones that made her skin crawl. She began noticing other oddities. Objects seemed to move on their own. A set of keys left on the counter would reappear on the coffee table, and the bedroom door sometimes locked itself from the inside. Eric shrugged it off, but Melissa's unease grew. One afternoon, while cleaning out the hall closet, Melissa found a small box tucked behind a loose floorboard. Inside were old photographs, yellowed with age. They showed former tenants of Harrow House, standing in front of the building with forced smiles. One photo caught her eye, a young man with a striking resemblance to Eric. The back of the photo was marked 1947. She showed the picture to Eric, but he laughed. "It's just a coincidence," he said. "Lots of people probably lived here over the years." Melissa wasn't convinced. Something about the photo sent a chill down her spine. The man in the picture wasn't just similar to Eric. He looked identical, down to the curve of his jaw and the way he held himself. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing the past to their doorstep. Determined to uncover the truth, Melissa began researching Harrow House's history. She scoured old newspapers and public records, piecing together a chilling timeline. Over the past century, dozens of tenants had lived in the building, but their stories all ended the same way. They vanished without a trace. No forwarding addresses, no belongings left behind. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. She confronted Mr. Kavanaugh, who grew visibly uncomfortable. "People come and go," he said, avoiding her gaze. "This isn't the kind of place folks stay in forever." Melissa wasn't satisfied with his evasions. She delved deeper, finding police reports of missing persons, all tied to the building. The more she read, the more she felt the walls closing in around her. Harrow House wasn't just old, it was a trap, a black hole that consumed its residents. Meanwhile, Eric began to change. He spent long hours alone, staring out the window or sitting in the darkened living room. He claimed he was fine, but Melissa noticed the way he spoke, slowly, as if listening to someone else before answering. He mentioned dreams of shadowy figures, their faces indistinct, beckoning him deeper into the building. "They're not bad dreams," he said one morning over coffee. "They're comforting, actually. Like, I belong here." Melissa's stomach turned. Harrow House wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. And whatever was inside it was pulling Eric away from her. One night, the whispers grew louder. Melissa woke to find Eric standing in the hallway, his eyes unfocused and his face pale. "They're here," he murmured, pointing to the living room. "They want to meet you." Melissa followed his gaze, her heart pounding. The living room was empty, but the air was thick and oppressive. She felt a presence, something unseen yet undeniably real. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows deepening and taking on shapes that defied logic. "Eric, come back to bed," she said, her voice trembling. But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, his lips moving silently. Desperate, Melissa grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the bedroom. He resisted at first, but eventually let her guide him away. That night, she didn't sleep. The whispers seemed to mock her, their words just out of reach. The next day, Melissa returned to her research, desperate for answers. She found a photograph of the building from the 1920s, its windows dark and lifeless. Beneath it was an article describing the building's original purpose. Harrow House had been a boarding house for transient workers, many of whom had died in mysterious accidents. Over time, the deaths were forgotten, but their echoes remained. Melissa realized the truth. The unseen tenants weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were fragments of those who had lived and died within the building, their identities fractured and incomplete. And now, they were feeding on Eric, using him as a vessel to reclaim their lost lives. Melissa knew she had to act quickly. Eric was slipping away, his connection to her growing weaker by the day. She searched the apartment for anything that could break the hold the unseen tenants had on him. In the hall closet, she found an old journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Its pages were filled with desperate pleas from a former tenant, describing their struggle to escape the building's grip. "The house doesn't let go," one entry read. "It takes you piece by piece until there's nothing left." Melissa realized she couldn't fight the tenants on their terms. She needed to confront them directly. That night, she set up candles in the living room and sat in the center, clutching the journal. Eric watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice layered with an unfamiliar cadence. It was as if someone else were speaking through him. "Yes, I do," Melissa replied. "You're not taking him." The air grew cold, the shadows twisting and coalescing into forms that hovered around her. The whispers grew deafening, their words a chorus of anger and desperation. Melissa opened the journal and began reading aloud, reciting the tenants' final entries. The shadows recoiled, their shapes flickering like dying flames. Eric clutched his head, groaning as if in pain. "Melissa, stop," he cried, his voice breaking. But she didn't stop. She kept reading, her voice steady despite her terror. The shadows surged toward her, but the candlelight held them back. Finally, with one last desperate plea, she shouted, "You don't belong here. Leave us alone." The room exploded with light, the shadows dissipating in a rush of cold air. Eric collapsed to the floor, his breathing ragged. Melissa rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, holding him close. "They're gone." The next morning, they packed their belongings and left Harrow House without looking back. The building stood silent and still, its secrets buried once more. But Melissa knew the truth. The unseen tenants were never truly gone. They were part of the house, waiting for the next unsuspecting residents to call it home. As they drove away, Melissa glanced at Eric, his face pale but his eyes clear. She vowed never to forget the lessons of Harrow House, and to protect their future from the shadows that lingered in the past.